everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to do another skills day, and I'm really excited for this one because I think it's incredibly useful. So we're going to be talking about emotional behaviors. Everybody behaves, so therefore this is useful for every living person on planet Earth, which is really cool because we're going to go through some ways that our emotions drive us to behave that we might not really be aware of, and then how we can behave differently and therefore really change some of the negative consequences that come from our actions. You might be listening to this because there is a certain emotion that is especially painful for you. I know for me it's shame. And everybody experiences anxiety, and so we'll act a lot out of a place from anxiety in ways that we might not know that we're doing. And I also think that this is especially helpful if you are wanting to help a friend or loved one, because you can start to notice, where are these behaviors coming from? Could they be coming from a place of really wanting to avoid a certain painful emotion? I recognize this. This is because they don't want to feel a certain way. And they don't even realize that this avoidance of emotion is pushing them to act in a way that's really damaging. And so getting to know, your emotions, which emotions you might be avoiding, and then therefore how you're behaving in response can be enormously helpful in improving your life. So Kibby and I have a lot of experience with this topic. I've taught it through the lens of the Unified Protocol, which is an intervention we've discussed the last 2 episodes. And Kibby has used this in DBT, so dialectical behavior therapy, which is a treatment for primarily borderline personality disorder, but is really helpful for anyone. So Kibby, can you talk to us about various emotions and what kinds of behaviors are associated with them?
Yeah, so both of the treatments that we're talking about, and pretty much any treatment that focus on emotion regulation, helping people with emotions, first leans into how emotions are really good and understanding them in order to help people actually change them, right? So it's kind of paradoxical. A lot of people come to us saying, oh, I'm so anxious, or I'm so angry, I have a problem with anger, make me stop being so angry. And actually first we lean the other way and say, let's understand your anger first. So we think about it, this is the way I think about it, like 2 main parts. There's like the feeling of the emotion, like what goes on in your body, what goes on inside, and then what you do in response to that emotion. In DBT, we really focus on how each emotion, we have it to satisfy a need in the environment. So if I am angry, that means like I need protection, something has hurt me, right? So of course there really is inherent in the idea that there's emotion, there's something that we do in response to it to like satisfy some need that we have, whether we're aware of it or not. So I'll go through a couple of examples. I was just talking about anger because it's fresh on my mind because people really struggle with that. They're like, anger has ruined my life. I've yelled at people. I storm away. I suppress and I get really depressed. But anger is a super important emotion. It's an emotion when we feel attacked or blocked from a goal. We actually had a whole episode on this. So when you feel attacked, you need to protect yourself, right? So that's why the associated behaviors might be balling up your fist, getting really tense, gritting your teeth, yelling at someone, storming away, fighting, right? So those are associated behaviors. Those are emotional behaviors for anger. Guilt is an emotion we feel when we think we did something wrong. So the associated behaviors are like apologizing, repairing, doing something different, right? Trying to fix the situation. Sadness. Sadness is a great one because if anyone has seen the movie Inside Out, the Disney movie, it goes all into that, and I just love it so much. But sadness is an emotion we feel when there's a loss or there's something missing, something important. So it makes us slow down, it makes us withdraw, and at the same time, expressing sadness actually can get people to support you, right? Mm-hmm. Elicit help from others, which is super, spoiler alert for Inside Out. But if you haven't seen that movie, watch it because it's a great one. Shame is an interesting emotion. That's a really social emotion. Shame is based on the idea that humans survive by being together, right? By being in a pack, coordinating and being accepted in a group. So shame is when you think that something about you is wrong, like a quality or characteristic that will get you rejected from the pack, from the group, and the associated behaviors are to hide that quality, right? Like stuff it in, pretend, kind of go along with the group, lie about parts of yourself, so that you don't get rejected. So yeah, those are some examples of the main emotions.
Yeah, shame is my favorite emotion to dissect and discover because I just think it's really interesting. You've got shame and guilt, which are so related, but people can actually feel them in kind of opposing amounts. So you see people who are high in shame proneness and low in guilt proneness, and that actually causes really big issues in their lives because guilt, they can both be associated with acting incorrectly, with doing something wrong or that other people judge as wrong. But when you feel guilt, you say, oh, my behavior was wrong and I want to rectify that. And when you're feeling shame, you say, oh, I'm wrong. And that can be so painful that it actually leads to anger because you can externalize the blame and say, no, it's your fault. You did something wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. And so it can lead to a lot of anger and fighting. And so that's one that I think is really important to target.
Yeah. There's a lot of treatments that I think try to shift shame into guilt, right? Instead of like you are a broken person, angry person, violent, whatever, you acted in a way that really hurt somebody else. So I feel like sometimes when you shift someone into guilt, it's more proactive because they could do something about that versus the idea that something inherent inside you is wrong and there's nothing you can do to fix it.
Yeah, actually, when people are highly shame prone, they can resist rectifying because they believe that they are so defective that rectifying the problem wouldn't even do anything. Like they wouldn't possibly be able to fix the situation, and so they get stuck. And guilt is interesting because it sounds like guilt is good. Like the associated actions are helpful. They rectify. They make things better, and that's true when you are feeling justified guilt, like you really did do something wrong. But often what I see with patients is that they're just feeling guilty all the time. They might have a parent or a spouse that picks on them a lot or that has put their needs before their child's. And so you get stuck in this guilt loop of, oh, I should be calling more. Oh, I'm always doing something wrong. And then you start apologizing, leaning into this person and to their needs and wants instead of your own. And so that can be really important to target and say, listen, did you do anything wrong? Or are you just so used to feeling guilt that you're making amends for things or putting energy into another person that you should be putting into yourself?
Yeah, the guilt is that's my albatross. It's like, I'm constantly guilt ridden. If I were to, I always describe it as anxiety because it just feels very like, just like very urgent, but it's really guilt. Like I just constantly feel like I'm doing something wrong. I didn't do enough. I think that whenever you are, consoling me during times of distress, it's always like you explaining why my actions made sense or what I did is okay, or, you validate in that way. Cause it's like, I constantly feel this justified guilt, even when someone else hurts my feelings or when someone else does something that, rubs me the wrong way. I deep inside, I trace it back to, well, I did something wrong. I did something to make them do that to me. Luckily, I don't feel a lot of shame, so it doesn't like consume me in that whole person way. But I do have that feeling. One OCD supervisor was talking about how guilt is a big emotion in OCD, and all of his patients kind of have this feeling in their chest, like in their sternum, of like that icky, like, oh, I did something wrong, I have to fix it. It's like, it's like right there. I'm like touching my chest right now, right there. And I feel that all the time. So that's me. The guilt-ridden one.
Yeah, I mean, that can be the subject of another episode too, because there are also physical sensations that go along with all these feelings. And that can be helpful to clue into too. Like you're saying, am I feeling the sticky feeling in my chest? Oh, okay, I know what that's about. And that can really, clue you into what is happening. People can also fear positive emotions. I mean, if we think about happiness, like what that causes people to do is go towards the thing that's making them happy. It can make them celebrate, get excitable, be highly emotionally aroused. And I actually remember when I was like in middle school, I was much more highly energetic, expressive, and I got really bad feedback for that. And so over time I kind of muted myself, and now I can find it difficult to experience or let myself experience like fully positive emotions.
Aww.
So that, yeah, I know, it's kind of a bummer.
Yeah, I think even with that example, you're tapping into kind of the last and the main associated emotional behavior we're talking about, which is avoidance. So when you feel afraid of something, fear, anxiety, right, that's an emotion that comes up when there's a threat, when there's something dangerous, either right in front of you, which is fear, or coming up in the future, anxiety, right? So what does that do? Fight or flight. You're going to run away from that danger, from that threat. And, that could lead to just avoidance, right? Avoiding something dangerous, which is tricky when it's something that you're talking about, which is avoiding an emotion, right? Like if you're afraid of being happy, you're going to avoid situations that lead you to be happy. So I'll punt it to you and describe. I know that you know the different types of avoidance, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so we can actually break down avoidance into a couple different types. And I think this is really helpful for realizing some things you might be doing that are kind of out of conscious awareness. The first is the easiest, which is overt avoidance. So this is when you're just literally and pretty knowingly avoiding the thing that makes you feel anxious. So for someone with social anxiety, this might be avoiding going to parties, avoiding going to one-on-one get-togethers or dates. I've met a lot of people who have avoided dates because they make them anxious. This might be avoiding a certain person who makes you feel anxious. Could be avoiding somebody that you really like, that you are attracted to, or it could be avoiding somebody like a parent with whom you've had a contested relationship because you just don't. You want to avoid maybe fights or anger or some kind of conflict. This is something that I do with work all the time. So, I've got ADHD. And so a lot of my relationship with work and productivity has made me really anxious because I'm used to making mistakes, getting some negative feedback, feeling like when I do work that isn't like last minute, that it just brings up like heavy distraction and frustration. And so these are all things I'll avoid, and then I'll push things off into the last minute, and then you can see where problems start there. The second kind of avoidance is subtle avoidance. So from the name, we can tell that this might not be something that is as obvious to you. So these are things that we do to subtly avoid emotions. So again, that person with social anxiety, they might go to the party, but they're on their phone the whole time. So they're really kind of, they might think that they're doing the thing they're supposed to do, but there's something they're doing that is preventing them from actually experiencing the thing. If I try to work or be productive and I'm browsing the internet the whole time, that's pretty like I'm sitting down and technically working, and maybe I'm writing a few sentences down, but I'm subtly avoiding the experience of the anxiety by constantly checking my email or online shopping or what have you. A really interesting form of subtle avoidance that I think a lot of people do not realize that they do is making jokes. So if you're ever talking to a person, maybe it's a difficult conversation, and you're using humor to kind of undercut the emotions so that you don't sink into sadness or fear or anger, and then you also don't, make the other person experience these emotions. Humor is something that can very often come in to keep you lifted and to make it seem like, oh, this isn't that big of a deal. And so a lot of this will come up in therapy all the time because patients will make jokes and I'll have to say, I hear you laughing, but this actually sounds really difficult. Like that actually what you're saying, if you strip away the laughter, it sounds really painful.
Yeah, that's a really tough one in therapy because when someone makes a joke or laughs, just the reinforcing social connection, right? Like you laugh together and suddenly you're very far away from that topic. Mm-hmm. So it's so effective, and You know, that's where you get these comedians like who are very famous for saying, like Robin Williams, for saying that they've made other people laugh to avoid, being criticized or to avoid other kind of emotions, but they're really depressed inside. So I love that you brought that up, because humor is such an effective one, because it really gets people to engage, but in an avoidant way.
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky, because I don't want to say stop being funny. And sometimes it's very adaptive to use humor to maintain a social bond when you actually want to share something serious about yourself. But if you recognize that maybe there's a time that you actually do need to connect, you need the other person to understand something essential about you, and you're using humor to prevent yourself from fully feeling or from making the other person uncomfortable, that's a time you might want to drop the jokes if you can. And if you see a friend doing this, because this happens all the time, right? If you're clued in, like, oh, my friend is trying to connect with me, but they're using a lot of jokes, you can maybe just try saying, like, oh my gosh, you're so funny, but when I really listen to what you say, it sounds really hard. Like, can you tell me more about that? You can strip away the joking and get to the meat of the issue really quickly. Okay, so another form of avoidance is cognitive avoidance. And the most obvious forms of cognitive avoidance are suppression and worry. And these are things we do all the time. We have an entire episode on worry that I think is definitely worth checking out, because worry is something that people think is helpful. They're like, oh, I'm attending to the problem. I can't be avoiding it because I'm literally sitting there thinking about it all day. But what worry really does is it allows you to avoid the feeling of uncertainty and powerlessness. People think that when they're worrying, they're doing something about the problem, and this allows them to not feel quite as helpless. But the problem is that it really has negative effects, and it doesn't actually do anything to solve the problem. There are forms of helpful problem solving that can actually get something done, but if you're either people aren't really accessing that, they're not doing true problem solving, they're just kind of like masticating these thoughts in their head over and over and over again. Or it's just not a problem that can be solved. It's something that actually is out of your control, and there's no amount of thinking about it that's going to help the situation. So if you find yourself worrying and worrying and worrying, maybe try giving yourself permission to set that process down. Just set down the thoughts. Go do something else. Worrying is not going to help. And then suppression is the other form of cognitive avoidance. And suppression is interesting because it can be helpful. For instance, if you're in a work meeting and something comes up that makes you want to cry or rage or whatever the case may be, you're probably going to want to suppress that because you can't show that behavior in front of your boss. But if you're doing this chronically, it has really negative effects. And this is something you can try yourself with the white bear experiment. If I tell you, hey, for the next 30 seconds, you can think about absolutely anything you want except for a white bear, usually two things happen. I'll let the person do this experiment, and they'll either say, yes, I thought about the white bear, or no, I didn't. And if they say, no, I didn't, I'll say, okay, well, what did you do to not think about it? And they'll say, I counted the ceiling tiles, or I picked out all the colors in the room, or I tried really hard to think of some other memory. And so what this means is that either when you suppress, you wind up thinking about the thing more anyway, because if you're really trying to push something down, it tends to come back up. Or if you manage to not think about it, it's because you're putting so much energy and resources into not thinking about it that you wind up depleting yourself anyway. So the last thing I want to talk about are safety signals. So these are either objects or people that you might bring with yourself to feel like you can handle a situation. So this would be like, okay, the person with social anxiety brings their best friend with them to a party. That's not like necessarily a bad thing to do, but it does kind of reinforce the idea that they need to be with their best friend in order to handle a social situation. And so then when they suddenly find themselves without that friend, they might feel really unmoored. And so it can be really important to try to put down these things that make us feel safe and just go into the anxiety-provoking situation yourself so that you can show yourself that you can handle it. This is also really common with panic disorder. People will bring a bottle of water, they'll bring Xanax. It's a huge like safety signal. If they feel like if they start panicking, they can just take a Xanax, then they're never really going to treat the root of the panic disorder. P.S. We have an episode on that as well. With misophonia, people tend to bring headphones with them everywhere so that they can block out noises. And with things like flight anxiety, this happens so often where people will have lucky socks, or I, even though I'm an atheist, have a little prayer that I say in the beginning of some flights. And I've really tried to make myself not do this. Not because saying the little prayer is like super energy depleting or anything like that, but it's just telling myself like, oh, I have more control over the situation when I actually don't. And the reason I got through this flight was because God intervened, even though that's not even something that I believe in. So often you might say, you might have a person with flight anxiety and they'll get off the flight and they'll say, hey, like that wasn't so bad, right? Look, everything was safe. And they'll say, well, yeah, it's because I had my lucky socks with me. And so they're really attributing, their safety and their lack of anxiety and things going well in the world to this object that has nothing to do with kind of the success of their mission. So when you're a therapist, you have to make sure, like, what socks are you wearing today? What things are you doing to make yourself feel safe? And what is this telling you? Are you telling yourself that you can't handle the situation? It's really this object that is handling the situation for you. What happens if you don't have that object? What are you, over time telling yourself? You're telling yourself that you can't handle things. You can't manage anxiety. You can't get through these situations alone. And so that's why it's really important to drop those safety signals.
I have a question. So the example that popped up on my mind, that comes up a lot in clinical work is people who use a drug or alcohol to get through, who cover up, to deal with their social anxiety, right? It's interesting because sometimes when people actually stop one problem, right, we work on one problem, then another emerges, right? Because you're finally getting to, what they were avoiding. But yeah, I've had some people say that they go to parties and then the only way they get through parties is by just being really, really drunk. And I'm curious of what kind of avoidance it is, because like subtle cognitive or safety signals, because it's this kind of thing where they avoid normal social interaction, so they just don't have to deal with like the normal fears of party life, but also because if they do something stupid or they do something that gets rejected from others or disapproval, they could say, oh, it's because I was drunk. So do you know like what kind of avoidance that would be?
So first of all, I would say that it doesn't have to be perfectly bucketed. I would say that plays into safety signals and subtle avoidance. You're going to the party, but you're relying on alcohol to get you through it. And so, so you're not fully experiencing, you're not fully experiencing the social situation in a way. And you're using alcohol as a safety signal to say, okay, it's the alcohol that's getting me through this, not me and my ability to be social. I mean, honestly, this is one that's so common. Like, I definitely use this. When I did my month of very little alcohol, like, I didn't really want to do group events as much anymore because I wouldn't have alcohol. I'd think it would be like exhausting. I'd have to really just rely on myself to be funny and charming, like without alcohol. And that really over time has a corrosive effect because you stop believing that you are funny and charming. Instead, it's I'm funny and charming when I have alcohol. I can socialize when I have alcohol, not just, oh, I'm a cool person and people like me.
Yeah, you've already been talking about the part that's like the downside of all these emotional behaviors is that they can have long-term consequences, right? Like you've mentioned that avoidance of something that you're afraid of could actually reinforce the idea that you can't handle something without like a safety signal or something like that. So that's kind of what we tend to talk about in therapy a lot in Unified Protocol and other kind of therapies is like what are the downsides of these emotional behaviors? That's really what people are coming into therapy for. So for example, something's really scary, that party's coming up, and you're thinking about all the things that could go wrong. If you avoid it your anxiety goes down real quick. Or if you get really you feel really hurt by someone, get really angry and scream at them, oof, then suddenly it just feels like, like you got that off your chest. So a lot of these emotional behaviors will have like an immediate reinforcing effect, right? The short-term benefits of feeling better, less distress. Oh, I got away from that situation that was scary, right? So something that's really reinforcing, and that's what makes these behaviors really sticky. That's what drives like the habitual part, right? Then every time the party comes up, you're like, oh my God, I can go. And then it will be so scary and uncomfortable and awful. My best friend's not even free that night. She can't come with me. And you avoid. And then you feel that reinforcing relief again and again and again. So that's why you do it a lot. So that I think that we talk about that because that's really validating for the person. They're like, why do I always scream at people when I'm upset? Why do I always avoid parties or avoid social situations? And I'm so lonely. And so because we do things that are reinforcing, right? We do things that make us feel good. And that makes us feel good really quickly, right? If you are constantly smoking cigarettes, it's because you have that immediate hit of the nicotine and it feels good. But in most of the time, those emotional behaviors work, right? They satisfy a need, you're all good, emotions go down. But there's some situations where those behaviors or that like pattern of behavior will have consequences in the long run, right?
Yeah.
First of all, it reinforces the emotion to start with, right? If I avoid something and I feel better, it's like, oh, thank goodness. That party was dangerous. I was going to make a fool of myself. Thank God I avoided it. Now I'm not embarrassed at all. This is great, right? Or if you are angry and get in a fight, you're probably going to get into more fights. And you're like, oof, I was right to be angry. Right now I'm like, full-blown back and forth. So it's kind of reinforcing the emotion itself, and that's why it could kind of get bigger over time. But also, they could have negative consequences, right? If I avoid parties, I'm going to be lonely. Not just parties. When you're saying parties, but I mean social interactions in general. Parties are, in the pandemic, we have a different relationship with them now. But if I act on my anger in a very aggressive way all the time, it's going to cause harm to our relationships, right? We might have felt good in that fight, but in the long term, people are not going to want to hang out with us, and they start to wear away at relationships and friendships and things like that. So there are times when, in certain situations, those emotional behaviors that feel like kind of this like knee-jerk reaction can actually lead to problems in our lives, and that's really what we work on.
Yeah, I mean, I believe neurologically, it's also true that the brain is going to basically encode solutions that work quickly the most. I mean, you're really trying to get the brain is trying to get you out of danger as quickly as possible. I mean, if we think about like living on the savannah, you see a tiger. Well, those are on the savannah, those are jungles. You see a lion, and the brain is like, get the fuck out of there quick. And you leave, and it's like, okay, whew, that worked. So it's really looking for these fast solutions. And that's why, there's nothing wrong with you if you find yourself really opting for avoidance over and over again, because you are getting that reinforcement effect. Like when something works quickly, you're going to remember it better. So that's why it really takes like conscious effort and practice to get yourself out of these bad patterns. So don't be surprised. Don't feel guilty if this is happening to you. Just know that there is a way out.
And you could think about that for your loved ones too. If your loved one or someone keeps acting in a way that, out of emotion that is like destructive or confusing, you could think about all these different emotions and the associated behaviors and go, oh, there's something about the way they're responding to that emotion that has worked in the past, that has actually led to some benefit. Every time I have a patient who comes in who says, I struggle with anger and I snap at people and I don't know why, my first thought is, well, they probably had to protect themselves a lot. They probably came from a really dangerous, maybe abusive background, or maybe a family that, just had a lot of anger expression. And this is what worked for them. This is what helped them survive and get to where they are. So instead of just going right to the blame and being like, why are you doing this? Obviously, this is causing problems in your current life. It's like remembering that this this behavior worked at some point, and especially in early environments or other environments that person spent a lot of time in. So that's just a way to kind of validate their emotions and validate the behaviors in response.
Yeah, I really like that. Like, this isn't just a behavior that you plucked out of the air that's unhelpful. It's like, this is a behavior that probably really helped you at some point and may have been totally adaptive for when you were a kid or when you were in a specific environment that was harmful to you. So it's just, a lot of this is figuring out, like, am I still in that environment? Do I still need this tool? Or am I in a new environment and this is actually hurting me? So there's some work to figure that out. Okay, so we've talked about all of these behaviors and, the doom and gloom associated, but how do we actually change this? This is one of my favorite skills because in some ways it's like stupidly obvious. In UP, we call this alternate actions. In DBT, we say opposite action. So if you're doing something that's unhelpful, what should you do to change it? Oh, I know. You do the exact opposite of that thing. So if you are feeling unwarranted guilt, if you're just feeling guilt all the time, it's so embedded in you and you're apologizing excessively and you're giving into demands and you're just trying to make other people happy, what can you do instead? Well, you definitely stop apologizing for things you have nothing to apologize for. You can purposely choose yourself. I had a patient who around holidays would just feel so much guilt about her parent. And so she would do things like stay an extra day or, put her parents' prized possessions around her room and take pictures and send it to that parent, even though that hadn't been asked of her. So we would work on like, when do you really want to leave? You want to leave a day early? Okay, we're going to leave a day early on purpose. You're going to put up your favorite decorations on purpose. We're going to not apologize. We're really going to focus on you this time instead of focusing on that other person. A lot of people also anxiously apologize because they just feel like they've always done something wrong. And so they'll apologize for being late, apologizing for getting something in that might have some mistakes. And so we'll work on, instead of apologizing, maybe thank the other person. Hey, thanks so much for waiting. Hey, thanks so much for editing this for me, instead of, oh my gosh, I'm sorry this isn't perfect, or oh, I'm sorry I'm 10 minutes late. Sometimes apologies are totally warranted, but other times they actually put the burden on the other person to be like, oh no, it's okay. No, really, it's fine. When you thank instead, it actually makes that other person feel better a lot of the time. And it reinforces to yourself, I don't have anything to apologize for. I can just feel gratitude right now instead of guilt.
Yeah, as we're talking, one example of a treatment that constantly uses alternative action without calling it that, I think it's Alcoholics Anonymous. Because if shame is an emotion that leads you to hide and leads you to say, something's wrong with me, I'm broken, let me just disappear and not show society what I'm doing. That's actually involved in a lot of addiction, right? Like people hide their drinking behavior, they lie about it, and then that makes things worse. So they actually make people stand up in front of a room and say, hello, my name is Kibby, I'm an alcoholic, right? Which is like the complete opposite to what shame wants you to do, which is like not be in front of a group of people and hide that you're even drinking, or even if you do, just kind of really look down and mumble something about your drinking behavior. So it's really like going the full opposite of don't hide it, show it, which I think is really cool. I
really hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah, I thought about that when I was learning about shame and just thinking about, the opposite action. If you teach it in session is, make eye contact with me, say the thing that you feel ashamed about, say it proudly, open your arms, like pretend this is something you're really proud of. He's like, and then I was like, oh yeah, they do that all the time in addictions treatment. It's just really admit fully what, your addiction and also the consequences of it. And I was like, that's really cool.
Yeah. What are some other popular opposite actions, like for anger, for instance?
Yeah, DBT works with anger a lot because a lot of people who come in have that kind of personality disorder or kind of emotion dysregulation, especially in anger. It's interesting because people find the opposite action of that really, really hard. So they allow you to do it in steps. So for anger, it's really like attacking the person, right? Like fight or flight. You want to fight someone. So you go the opposite. be really, really nice to them. So the total opposite action to anger is think about why that person's perspective makes sense, open your arms, smile, be loving, be really welcoming, right? And doing that will actually shut off the anger over time, because actually you're like telling yourself with those behaviors, like, this is not someone who's attacking you. This is someone who actually is a collaborator of yours, right?
Yeah.
And that's the interesting thing too that we're talking about. Doing the opposite action will shut off the initial emotion over time, because you're telling yourself, oh, I'm being super nice to this person over and over. This is not someone who I need to protect myself from, right? You're like turning off the initial signal. But of course, people really hate it whenever we say, like, what do you mean I have to like be really nice to the person who called me blah, blah, blah? It's like, okay, well, there's a skill called willing hands, where you just open your hand, you like physically embody acceptance. So you open your hands up, small smile, maybe think about that person, maybe think of why their actions make sense. So you like inch your way towards the total opposite action of being super nice to that person. So yeah, but it's basically treating the other person as not a threat. What's the opposite of that? Someone who you love, right? So
yeah. When it comes to avoidance, there's just what you're avoiding gives you a pretty big clue of how to change your behavior. Some people, after, for instance, a breakup, might immediately just go and drink with their friends and just try to push through the sadness and totally ignore it. And for them, we'd say, like, why don't you draw a bubble bath, order some food, some ice cream, whatever. Like, let yourself be sad. Do the things, allow other people to help you through this. If you're somebody who avoids conflict, I see this all the time. People will just invalidate their own perspective so that they don't have to have a conflict with another person. They can avoid that. And that's where we might bring in Dear Man, which is a skill that helps you confront another person in a skillful way. So, you don't want to ignore yourself. Don't invalidate yourself. If you have a conflict with a person and your natural inclination is to avoid it, like, let's think about how to do it in a way that respects your needs and is skillful. So, there's all sorts of things that can be done, and working with a therapist to identify these is really important.
Yeah, how would you do it in the Unified Protocol? I'm curious what that looks like. I'm way more familiar with DBT. I'd love to see what the UP looks like, and help me with my guilt. It's actually something I'm actively working on. Gosh, it's like Jacqueline does therapy in public.
So we'd go through a worksheet, and we'd try to brainstorm, like, what are some avoidance behaviors you're noticing in yourself, or what are some behaviors that your emotion is driving you to do. We would do this in one session, then you'd go home, you'd do this for homework. So you'd notice throughout the week, like, oh shit, I think this is what we were talking about in therapy. And so we'd have a whole list of these behaviors. Okay, so Kibby, if you think about what guilt drives you to do, what are some various behaviors?
Yeah, I'll go with what I was talking about last time, which is like I constantly feel like I'm not doing enough and I need to be more productive. And when it feels like anxiety, but when I boil down to it, it's both guilt and anxiety. So I really just avoid not being productive or not achieving or not, getting that gold star in some way. So I constantly will overload myself and do more and more and more, take on more and more tasks and responsibilities and projects until I'm like swamped all the time and feel overwhelmed.
So I'm hearing a couple of things in here. One is that it sounds like you have trouble saying no if there are opportunities available.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's that part. Does that have a social component? Like, you want to be seen as cooperative, as okay, she's nodding.
Saying no to something feels wrong. Feels like, it's a social component of not wanting to seem like a helper, someone like a team player, but also want to look like I'm someone who's super productive and can take on whatever people ask me.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we can work with that that behavior independently. And then another one, I mean, when you say you take on all this stuff, what does that look like when you're at home? Are you just working constantly? Are you maybe not working constantly, but it's more that you're just feeling extreme guilt when you do anything other than work? Like, how break that down?
All of the above. I'll give you what I was doing today. Woke up, realized it was daylight savings, and felt guilty that I lost an hour of work. So that guilt just left me in a panic, and I decided to get some breakfast, and I didn't do anything in a paralysis for about an hour. And then thought about all the different things I had to do today, and did lots of work. Spent the rest of the time constantly trying to fill up my time with productive stuff. And when I was eating lunch today, I felt guilty that I was taking more time away from doing things. So yeah, it's all of the things you just said.
Oh, God. If you were my patient, I couldn't tell you how insane that sounds, but since you're just... Okay, so let's work with the first one. Trouble saying no to things. What are the consequences of that, both short-term and long-term?
Oh, gosh. That is something I'm really working on. It's really hard to do, especially if you have a reputation or habit of saying yes a whole bunch. Saying no for the first time feels awful, and comes with a lot of shock sometimes. So are you saying the short-term and long-term consequences of saying no, or saying yes to too much stuff?
Sorry, yeah, of saying yes to too much stuff.
Yeah. Oh, God, this happened just this week. So the short term is that, someone reminded me of a project I said yes to a while ago, and I'm just really overloaded with too much stuff. I'm studying for this licensing exam, and doing the postdoc and this podcast and all the different things that I love. But someone said, hey, okay, we're ready to do this project, Kibby. It's gonna be a lot of work. Are you ready? And I didn't really say anything to that. I just said, oh, okay, great. Oh, that's so exciting. And the short-term consequence of that was that they probably were really happy. I felt good. I felt like the team player that they wanted. I felt excited to get on another project, because that is kind of reinforcing in its own way for me. I haven't gotten to the long-term consequences yet, but I know that I don't have the hours in my day to do that.
Yeah. Well, you've done this kind of thing before, so what have the long-term consequences been of? Yeah,
I don't have enough time, and so I get overloaded. So I look at my schedule and I go, oh my God, I have literally no time to fit in these things. I'm constantly doing things all day and scrambling to do one thing or the other. And the really long-term consequences is just it actually does backfire in terms of productivity and achievement. I am so scrambling to do each thing that I probably half-ass a lot of them, and or get resentful that I have to do something that I said yes to. So I'm angry at myself, but just sitting around with anger. And then the negative consequences is sometimes I screw up something, or I let something slip because I'm just so overwhelmed, or I'm just frozen. I'm just I spent all my time working, that I'm so burnt out, I'm so overwhelmed, and I just kind of give up, It leads to problems with my health, get really sick and really exhausted, or I just freeze and don't do anything for, a little while, and that makes it worse.
Yeah, so just for the sake of brevity, I'll kind of bring in some other things that could be going on with you. And I don't know if this is specific to you, but let's just in general, this process, what can happen then is, you initially make that person really happy, but then you half-ass the work, and so they're less happy later.
Yeah.
This could also ricochet into your other relationships, where you have less time to spend with loved ones because you're so busy working and being productive, and so that can cause problems there. If you're feeling a lot of resentment and a lot of stress, that can make you high-strung, more likely to snap. Again, can affect your relationships.
Oh,
you're
cutting into the core, Jacqueline. Oh, I feel seen and attacked at the same time.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really amazing how there are these really enticing short-term benefits, but the long-term benefits are so great. I mean, just the fact that this is affecting your health is like a really big sign that maybe something needs to change here. So then I think this opposite action is fairly obvious. What can you do instead of saying yes?
Oh, it's even painful to say it. I don't want to say it. Obviously, saying no to things, and probably saying no to things that I probably could fit in my schedule. I just really have a terrible sense of what I can fit in. So I probably have to go say no to things that I think I could fit in, but probably would bring me closer to like a normal 9-to-5 workday.
Yeah.
Just thinking about that makes me feel terrible. And like taking days off, maybe like I have a vacation coming up and actually not working on that vacation, maybe not feeling guilty about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like squirming as like you guys can't see it, but I'm just like,
Kibby, that's disgusting. Stop worrying so much. Kibby and I clearly have opposite problems. So this is what you would do in therapy too, right? Is you would tell the person that they're disgusting and they need to change. And they're insane and crazy.
When you do that to me, it works.
No, I just have the opposite problem, and so even listening to this just makes me squirm. Yeah, so like the obvious alternate action is to say no to things, and that's easiest when you have a really specific situation coming up. Like you're about to be offered something, okay, now you need to say no instead of yes. And then like a long-term therapy, we could do a few things now. We could work on skills building. Like if this person really doesn't know how to say no, we can help them with that. Kibby was also talking about like maybe even saying no to things that she technically does have room for. This can bring in some values work of like, okay, so you technically have room for these things, but what kind of person do you want to be? Do you want to be the person who works constantly, or are there other things that you value that you want to bring back into your life? And so that can really set the stage for, managing your life in a different way. And so then what we would do is we'd say, okay, what are the short and long-term consequences of saying no? Well, the short term would be she might disappoint somebody. She might feel an initial spike of anxiety and guilt. But long-term, better health outcomes, better relationships, hopefully, less burnout. So, we'd really go through the patient and say, like, what are the short and long-term consequences for doing the thing you're doing now? And then what are the short and long-term consequences of changing and doing the opposite? And they typically mirror each other. Mm-hmm.
Honestly, the most convincing one is that I probably will end up doing the thing better, right? Yeah. To actually achieve things better by cutting out stuff, and so that actually will satisfy that guilt of I'm not doing enough, I'm doing things wrong, or not achieving enough. That actually will help me achieve if I actually cut out stuff. So that's the one that I could actually buy into, and the rest I'll feel someday.
So basically, you mentioned a few other behaviors. We don't need to go through the whole tree for these, but just thinking about, for instance, you're eating lunch and you're literally feeling guilty about feeding your body instead of doing more work. So what is an alternate action that could be done here?
Probably really telling myself that that's actually a good thing. It's not doing something wrong to take lunch, but say like, it's important that I take lunch. I have to do it. And it's the right thing to do, and block off time and really enjoy it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you want to very purposely say, this is not something I need to feel guilty for. In fact, this is something that I should feel the opposite of guilt for. I should feel pride. I should feel good about this. And there's a couple routes to this. Like, one is you can give yourself affirmations if that's something that works, and say over and over again to yourself, I need to be doing this. This is good. You can make this as rewarding as possible. For the first while where you get used to this, you can make the food super delicious, like get your favorite meal together so that you're enjoying it even more than you otherwise would be. You're not having, a utilitarian lunch. You're having a delicious lunch. You could try mindfulness here. So, it sounds like there's some cognitive avoidance coming in here with the worry throughout lunch. And so instead you take a really mindful bite and you smell the food and you feel how it feels in your mouth and the taste and all of that. And really concentrate on the experience of eating instead of that worry rumination. And so then we go into long and short-term consequences. You get the idea?
Yeah, that's cool.
And then you were talking to me before this about how opposite action is very, very similar, but it takes into consideration context a little bit more.
Yeah, with DBT, they talk a lot about context. I think a lot of these therapies do, but really hammering home the idea that different emotional behaviors make sense for different situations and may not for others, right? Mm-hmm. Like lashing out in anger might have worked in your family of origin, but doesn't really work in your adult workplace, right? Mm-hmm. And so we would do that in DBT, like that's kind of pros and cons of each of these actions, but we might do it with the context in mind. Like, okay, at work, if someone hurts your feelings, you lash out and don't lash out. What are the pros and cons of each there? Mm-hmm. And that might be different than like at home or with your parents or something like that, right? Like lashing out at someone who's like abusive at home or something might actually work.
Yeah.
There might be more pros and cons. So we really take that into account and remember that it's all about flexibility and adapting to new situations. What's difficult is people tend to want to use the same strategy for every situation because that's just easier. Mm-hmm. That's just what they're used to. But remembering that we are, when you grow up and you become an adult, you move to new places, see new people, are different contexts. You're a mother, you're a daughter, you're also an employee. So you're all in all these different situations, and different emotional behaviors will work better in different contexts. So that's the only addition we would do.
I think it's a good final point. I mean, I've had a lot of patients who are deathly afraid of expressing anger, and that can be really adaptive sometimes. But, if somebody tries to kidnap my child, I'm going to lash out in the most extreme way possible. And that's pretty adaptive usually, right? So mm-hmm. even these extremes of emotions, they have their place. It's just maybe the place is not very frequent or, we really need to always be adapting our emotional expressions and behaviors to the situation we're in. And so helping patients understand that is a really important part of the work.
For people who thought this was really interesting and they want to know more, kind of work on themselves, or they have an emotion that they struggle with a lot, like me with guilt, we'll put up some resources on our website with some worksheets and information about emotions and their emotional behaviors. So check that out.
Okay, well, I hope you found this helpful. Again, this is just one of my favorite lessons because it's just universally useful. And it's one where I think we can look in the mirror and say, okay, I'm doing some things here, aren't I? And also one where we can say oh, my partner's lashing out. Is this just a learned response to shame or to anxiety? How can I help them change this behavior? How can I see what's going on here? So if you are somebody, for instance, who does not rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast, you might consider taking an alternate action and writing us a really nice note on Apple Podcasts, giving us a nice 5-star rating. And I think that we would all be the better for it. So thank you. I'll leave you to do that homework, and we'll see you all next week. By accessing this podcast, I acknowledge that the hosts of this podcast make no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast. The information, opinions, and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only, and any reliance on the information provided in this podcast is done at your own risk. This podcast and any and all content or services available on or through this podcast are provided for general, non-commercial informational purposes only and do not constitute the practice of medical or any other professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and should not be considered or used as a substitute for the independent professional judgment, advice, diagnosis, or treatment of a duly licensed and qualified healthcare provider. In case of a medical emergency, you should immediately call 911. The hosts do not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast, and information from this podcast should not be referenced in any way to imply such approval or endorsement.